Welcome to this inaugural event in our series, Contagion Cultures. I'm so happy that we're doing it. It's been really fun working with Warren on this, and I think we're a good working partnership. So I really kind of get right to it, kind of go-getter person to work with. So that's fabulous. We're broadcasting today from Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. And it's both an imperial and an educational project, Queen's. It was established in 1841 by an imperial royal charter on Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. We make this land acknowledgement to encourage us to consider the significance of this place for the Indigenous peoples who lived here prior to the colonial project and who continue to live here today, despite the genocide and assimilation in which our institution is implicated, and from which many of us have benefited and continue to benefit. Contagion Cultures is a Faculty of Arts and Science collaboration between the School of Public Policy Studies, Warren Mabee, and Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, Gender Studies, Film and Media Studies, and Cultural Studies, Jennifer Hosek. Chris Cornish at the School of Policy Studies and Mark Schwartz and the Queen's Library are providing substantive support to this initiative. So we thank everyone for that. The talks will be live streamed every Tuesday or most every Tuesday at 4 p.m. beginning today, July 7th, 2020. We hope you can join us each week. Please register ahead of time in order to join via Zoom as you did today. The talks will be available freely online, and they're also going to be archived in the library, and we particularly hope that these original contributions by our Queen's faculty will be used by instructors in their classroom. Queen's Contagion Cultures helps to make sense. Queen's Contagion Cultures helps to make sense of this pandemic through expertise and insights of arts and science faculty members. Contagion Cultures is a public-facing series that asks important questions and explores multiple responses to such questions. It leverages the powerful tools of arts and science humanistic analysis to help society grapple with our turbulent times. Let me make a plug here for a complimentary virtual event series entitled Conversations Confronting COVID-19, which focuses on medical research here at Queen's. We certainly need all hands on deck to deal with this enormous challenge in the best ways possible. Every issue, every concern, every challenge is multidimensional. Take the fervently hoped for vaccine. The technical aspects of creating one is but the tip of the iceberg. For instance, who should be and who is getting the funding to do which research on which type of potential vaccine? Why are they getting these resources and not other researchers? What use is the intense competition among labs when speed and success are of the utmost importance? How will such realities impact when a vaccine will be available, how it will be available, to whom it will be available, and at what cost? For instance, if a for-profit research organization uses taxpayer monies to develop a very novel type of recombinant vaccine, will they sell it for a profit? And how will it be able to be mass produced? Will it be massively available? For instance, if a country not favored by some Western countries like Cuba, like China, creates a vaccine using a more traditional and more easily mass produced inactivation method, then who will be able to access that vaccine and how quickly? For instance, on whom will prototype vaccines first be tested? The long history of testing drugs on human subjects, particularly people of color, or the US military, people in the global South, it seems poised to repeat. These are societal issues, and these are policy issues. Another example, mask wearing. The science was clear from the start. Why did officials in so many non-Asian countries vacillate on issuing mask wearing directives? Some of the many intersecting discourses include racism, most directly the overt racism towards people visibly marked as Asian or of Asian descent who wore masks in countries like Canada early on. It seems to me that structural racism is at play too. Learning from Asian countries, and I know countries with firsthand recent experience with SARS and H1N1, learning from Asian countries seems difficult for white-dominated countries' leaderships to do. Sexism, machismo, many people who identify as men are reported saying that they think it's not masculine to wear a mask. Individualism, many of these same people and others as well do not want to wear masks because masks do not give much direct protection to the wearer. An example of a combination of machismo and individualism was captured in a now viral interview. A family father stating that his wife and children wear masks, but he does not. So it would seem from his statement and his practice that his interest in upholding his masculinity and his individualism trumps his desire to protect his loved ones. Some researchers and I have been doing some interviews with Cubans on the island on the topic of mask wearing. You may or may not know, depending on what media you might be watching, something that we might have time to talk about, certainly we'll have time to talk about in our series. You might or might not know that Cuba is the leader in COVID crushing success stories domestically and internationally. Indeed, there is a campaign to nominate Cuba's Henry Reeve International Medical Brigades for the Nobel Prize. When the Cuban government figured out that COVID was coming and knew that they did not have masks to provide to their citizens, they did not pretend that masks didn't matter. Instead, they gave their population detailed instructions on how to make masks for themselves, and they mandated their use. People were fined if they did not wear their masks in public. Now, because Cuba is often charged with having an authoritarian system of governance, my research team and I are asking members of the populace what mask wearing means to them. So on the ground asking, right? And 90% of those interviewed so far have been telling us that even without the potential fine, they would wear masks. They would wear masks because masks protect other people and also by extension themselves. And they say that they see it as a social obligation to wear masks. So we can see that at least among these interviewees, their sense of self is defined at least in part in relation to their community rather than in opposition to it. Juxtapose this sense of self against that of the family father, whose sense of self seems to be defined in opposition to others. So this research that I'm doing is very much a work in progress, but I think that it shows us, it's an example that shows us that cultural analyses, for example, of chauvinisms and identity, explain a lot of aspects of the to mask or not to mask question. Queen's Contagion Cultures series aims to unpack the pandemic along multiple trajectories, such as these examples, the two that I just gave. For example, next week on Tuesday at 4 p.m., in her talk entitled Meet, Pray, Love, Samantha King, whom you just virtually saw almost, will be exploring human-animal relations in these COVID times. Samantha is a professor of kinesiology and health studies who works on embodied dimensions of consumer culture. I'm sure it'll be a fabulous talk. I've seen many of her talks and they're always very interesting. So I hope that you can come. For now, though, we're going to get to hear from Warren, who's going to finish explaining the details of the Q&A, introduce himself, and then talk about energy, climate, and COVID. And then I'll be following with some thoughts about mobility in this pandemic. And after the Q&A, and then we'll have the Q&A, and we'll aim to wrap up in a total of 50 minutes. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Jen. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. My name is Warren Mabee. I'm the director of the School of Policy Studies. I'm delighted to see so many people taking time out of your afternoon. I hope that you are cooler where you are than I am where I am. I have no air conditioning where I am sitting right now. So if I wilt in front of you, it is not due to the pressure, it is just due to the heat. I'd like to say a few words just about how we're going to work this webinar, and then I'll jump into my topic and introduce myself a bit more. So we are in a Zoom webinar. Some of you will have used this before. If you move your mouse around on the screen, either at the top or the bottom, depending on your operating system, you will see a number of controls pop up. One of those controls is Q&A, and if you click that, you will get a question and answer box where you can pose questions to us. And that is the best way to reach out and contact us. We can experiment with people raising hands. I think probably would rather do it through the Q&A function, but if there's a direct question and you want to raise your hand, do, and we'll work out how to make that work. I'm a professor in the School of Policy Studies, and I'm the director of the school right now. I'm also a professor in geography and planning, and I have a background in forestry, so I am a very mixed up person if you think about it. My area of specialty and expertise is really around energy and climate change. I'm very interested in the intersection between energy policy and environmental policy. And I'm very, very interested to see what COVID-19 is going to do to those two files. So let's explore that a little bit. I'm going to actually share my screen, and I'm going to pop up my presentation. So what you should see in front of you now is a slide that says energy, climate change, and COVID-19. And we'll just walk through this. It'll take a few minutes, but it should give you a good idea of what I'm thinking about. So first, let's start with some statistics. This is the world's energy use. It is the most recent data that we have through the International Energy Agency. There are a number of different agencies out there that track data on global energy consumption. They're all different. Every agency has slightly different numbers. I like the IEA because I've worked with the IEA for years, but you could use the Energy Information Agency through the US, and you can use other tracking functions. Bloomberg actually tracks world energy use and a couple of other agencies. What we can see when we look at energy use is, first of all, it's really a great big red Pac-Man eating a few renewables on the side. So the red pie slices are all fossil energy sources. And those fossil energy sources include oil, coal, and natural gas. They make up 70%, give or take, of total energy production across the world today. And energy consumption is rising every year. So it's going up by about 1.1% per year, and it's been doing that since 2012. So we're seeing an energy mix in the world that is dominated by fossil energy that has been rising. A few interesting trends: coal use is going down, and that's good news because we've been trying to get coal use down for a long time. Coal is the worst of the fossil fuels when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, particularly with older plants. So all the older plants out there are really problematic when it comes to GHG emissions. But oil use has been going up. It's going up by about 1.7% per year. Oil is used primarily for fuels, so for gasoline and diesel fuel, for the production of asphalt, and for the production of chemicals. All of those things are in demand, and they are all going up. Natural gas is going up by about 2% per year, and that's been accelerating as coal use has been falling back. And nuclear use, after a few years of decline, is starting to come back up again. So we did see a period where nuclear power was actually waning, particularly after the Fukushima event in Japan. We are now starting to see it creeping back up. However, there's a good news story here, which is that 15% of energy used in the world today is renewable, spread across biomass, hydroelectric, and other renewables like solar and wind. And that's going up fairly fast by about 1.5% per year. So if you include nuclear in the mix, you've got 20% of the energy sources in the world coming from fairly clean sources. Not everybody includes nuclear, but we will for right now. And particularly the new renewables, solar, wind, and geothermal, are going up in a hurry, about 16% per year. So we're seeing massive change and massive movement towards cleaner energy, but we're facing an incumbent energy industry, the oil, the gas, and the coal, which still dominates the picture. So that's the whole world. Let's look at Canada. Here's what Canada looks like. We are 2% of global energy production on 0.5% of global population. So we are a very small piece of the global energy picture, but we are an even smaller population, which means that our proportionate use, our per capita use is high. We have seen energy consumption increase a fair bit since 2010. So it's been going up by about 4.2% per year since 2010. And this is problematic. It's problematic because it's outstripping our pace of population growth. And if you really pour into the statistics, what you find out is that a lot of that growth has happened in recent years. So just in the last few years, we've seen a big spike in energy consumption. And that's worrisome because we've been trying to bring energy use down to bring emissions down. Oil has gone up a lot. So we're driving more. Up until March of this year, we were driving more. We have become a Walmart/Amazon economy, meaning that we do a lot of shopping in big box stores and we do a lot of shopping online. So our diesel use has gone up. Nuclear power has actually gone up because we've reactivated a couple of the reactor sets at the Bruce and at Pickering. So we've seen an increase in nuclear use. But we have 18% renewables and 18% going up by about 1.8% per year, with solar, wind, and geothermal going up by about 36% per year. So not as fast as the world average, but fast compared to lots of other places. Canada is still dominated by fossil energy, just like the rest of the world. And if we do want to make a dent at our emissions, we've got to deal with this. And the challenge really is that the most recent number, we're at 724 megatons of CO2 equivalents per year. That's what our emissions look like. That was 2018 figures, broken down like this. So oil and gas, about a quarter. Transportation, including light and heavy duty and aviation and marine, about a quarter. Electricity, buildings, industry, and agriculture, about 10% each. And then a few little pieces left over: construction, waste, and coal production, which is the remaining pieces of this puzzle. These emission sources are not static, they are changing. So building emissions are going up every year, industry is going up, transportation in heavy duty and aviation is going up, and oil and gas production emissions are going up, although these trends are slowing down as we start to see the roadblocks in terms of pipeline development, things like that kicking in. A couple things are coming down. Light duty transportation is coming down, and electricity production is coming down in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. We're going to cleaner sources. And that electricity production decline is largely due to Ontario phasing out coal. There was some news today that Alberta has actually changed the rules a little bit around coal and coal exports, and a lot of people worry that's going to lead to increased coal production out west. So that's the challenge that we're dealing with, and policymakers up until the last few months have been really focused on developing solutions that address each of these different buckets. And where we've succeeded around electricity and around light duty transportation, it has come about because of long-term investment in policy solutions and technologies that can move us in the right direction. So what about COVID-19? What is that doing to the big picture? What is that doing to the overall emissions? So I'm going to cite some recent work here. It was published in Nature Climate Change, and I'm giving you the DOI connection there so that you can go directly to this journal article that looked at declines in daily fossil energy use across a number of different economies in Europe, in Asia, and North America, in order to try to figure out what was going on as the world entered a lockdown. Because you can imagine, I'm sure everybody's thinking, we're locked down, we're not doing as many things as we used to do. People aren't flying very much, so that's certainly got to have an impact. People aren't driving as much. That's got to have an impact. Some industries have slowed down or shut down. That's got to have an impact. People are working at home, and that's got to have some kind of an impact. Well, this was the first study that really started to show us what's going on. And what they found is that daily fossil CO2 emissions across different nations declined by an average of 26%. 26% on a daily basis. Well, that's a pretty big thing. And certainly if it lasted for a full year, I'm sure many of us are sitting there thinking, gosh, I hope it doesn't last a full year. Well, that would be a 26% decline in emissions. But it's really only occurred now for about 4 months, so about a third of a year. So you would get a third of that reduction, about an 8%, give or take, decline in emissions across the board, on average. That's an 8% decline in emissions attached to a huge amount of economic and social upheaval, a huge amount of disruption. So when I look at these numbers, I think, well, you know, maybe a little bit of a good news story, but certainly a lot of a bad news story too. So can we dive into those numbers a bit more and understand a bit more of what's going on to inform the next round of policy decisions? So let's do that. Let's look at what would have happened across Canada from March till July. So March, April, May, and June, a 4-month period, to our emission portfolio. So the same slide that I showed you before, slightly different because I'm not breaking the waste up into the different categories. But what you can see is that in oil and gas, we think we've seen about a 30% decline in emissions, which translates over the course of a year into a 21 megaton reduction. 21 megatons, it's a big impact. In fact, it's probably the biggest single impact that we have seen across the board. Oil production is really not moving very fast right now. Oil production is seizing up, and it's largely because prices have been so low. In fact, they were negative a little while ago, which has not happened ever. So to go to negative cost on oil, you know that not many people are making money. Light duty transport, probably down about 50%. Half of the journeys that people would have taken are gone. Now, I think that number might be a bit low, but in Canada, that might be realistic because people do drive a lot. They drive to the store. Many people live in rural or peri-urban areas that need to drive to be able to do shopping, things like that. People are moving their cars around as it is, so 50% is probably reasonable. That's an 18 megaton reduction. Heavy duty transport down a little bit, but not much because we've kept the trucks going through this whole thing. So a 4 megaton reduction. 75% drop in aviation. And that is probably conservative, but it still only translates into a 2 megaton reduction. We tend to think of aviation as this huge problem, and yet overall it's a small piece. Small reduction in electricity, but also an increase in emissions associated with buildings, and that has to do with us staying at home and using power at home. And then other industry, we're seeing some reductions across the board, about a 30% reduction in productivity. And those numbers may not stay static. You know, it depends on what happens as we go to phase 3. It depends on where we go. So total, all across the board, 53 megatons. That's what we've probably seen over the last 4 months, 7% of our annual emissions, which is great because 7% of our annual emissions is actually kind of where we want to get to anyway. We want to figure out ways to make these kind of reductions permanent. And we want to be able to do that year after year because remember that our current government, the Liberal government, is talking about 80% reductions in our emissions by the year 2050 and about 100% reductions in our emissions by the year 2100. So in just about 80 years, we would have to reduce from 724 megatons down to roughly 0. These types of reductions are the level of reductions that we need to be seeing on an ongoing basis. Unfortunately, not all of these drops have been wins across the board. So a drop in light duty fuel use, that could be a win-win. People keep working without commuting. Now, some people have lost their jobs, so it's not a win-win for everybody. Lots of people have been able to keep their jobs and to work from home. Lots of people are enjoying the fact that they do not have to commute. They do not have to invest that time. They have extra time every day to spend with their families, to cook healthier foods, to do some exercise, to do all the things that they might want to do. The drop in energy production figures is probably a win-lose. We win because we're losing the emissions that go along with that. We lose because people are losing jobs. And these are Canadians, you know, they're our fellow citizens. They're losing jobs and we're losing money in the tax base. And this is going to be a big thing because although energy is not really that big as a part of our total economy, it's a very large part of our export economy. And as we lose exports, we lose that kind of positive balance of trade that allows a lot of us to lead the kind of lives that we're used to. So this is going to be a problem and needs to be addressed as we go forward. The aviation drop is big in terms of percentages, but it's almost insignificant in terms of the amount of CO2 reduced. It's not the area where we need to be investing a lot of policy time, I don't think. This is something that the international community has been looking at. It's really an international problem. In terms of Canada moving forward on this, chasing this is like chasing that one little marred part on your table when the rest of your house is burning down. You really need to look at other parts of the emissions portfolio. And the drop in some electricity emissions are definitely offset by higher energy use. And what we don't know is what's going on as we move ourselves online. You know, where are the servers that we're using? Where's that? Where are we going as we explore the internet and as we do that work? And what kind of impacts are those things having? And we do access servers that are overseas, and we run through networks that are overseas. So this is a challenge. These are the areas where we're doing a lot of work right now in terms of policy development. As a last couple words before I hand back over to Jen, I will say that the School of Policy Studies has undertaken a series of COVID response working groups. Energy and environment is one, but we have groups on art and culture. We have groups on economics. We have groups on healthcare and on mental health. We have groups on security and international governance issues. And all of these groups are working to try to develop you know, solutions, policy solutions to some of these types of questions. And I'm sure that over the next few weeks, you'll see many of those groups come forward and present in this series. So with that, I've used up my allocated time. I would like to say thank you to everybody. I see there's some questions coming in already, which is awesome. I'm going to hand back to Jen so that Jen has her shot at her talk. So
thank you, Warren. That was fascinating to get a kind of an overview of what we sort of have a sense of it, but you really broke it down and made it very concrete. So thank you for that. Yes, so I get paid primarily to do transnational German studies with a connection between Germany and Cuba. I'm in languages, literatures, and cultures. So that's my home department. I'm affiliated with gender studies, with film and media, and with cultural studies. I have a lot of interest in many areas, and I have recently been working on urban mobility cultures, particularly cultures of mobility that are trying to move away from the privately owned vehicle. And so that also situates my work in critical petrocultural studies, petrocultures. And yes, and so today I'm talking a bit about mobility and immobility and privilege. And I'm going to be reading about in the I, starting in the I as an athletic feminist type I surprised myself recently by buying very expensive high-heeled shoes. My salary can now cover an occasional taxi if my shoes demand no rainy day bicycling, seems to me. Congratulations for all of the recent graduates. We wish that the times weren't like this, and we hope that you're gonna save us with your knowledge that you learned in school. This bicycle, these shoes, if it doesn't work, taxi. But the real question, why was I spending on the privilege of restricting my mobility through these impractical, uncomfortable, and unhealthy shoes? Doesn't feminism aim to get us past the Western version of the mobility hampering foot binding tradition? Shouldn't I be wearing something more like this? It also seemed misguided that I was falling into conspicuous consumption in purchasing this shrinked and pinked version of a Little Red sports car. Worse yet, this middle-aged consumer crisis item would not even be getting me very far very fast. Scholarship in mobility studies, notably a fabulous book by Mimi Scheller, Mobility Justice, has robustly shown how mobility expresses privilege and vice versa. Enter the pandemic. As have other hypermobile diseases before it, COVID-19 is inverting the paradigm. Nowadays, privilege is expressed in immobility. Those who can afford to stay home. According to scientific best practices and governmental directives, this makes, of course, good sense. Self-isolating immobility expresses good citizenship, neighborliness, and ethics. It furthers our common aim of flattening the curve. Those of us who can afford to stay home are doing their part. We may think gratefully about our privilege as we model our good citizenship and stay at home, as Samuel L. Jackson says. At the same time, the majority of humanity cannot participate in such voluntary immobility. Refugees, migrants, and even supererogating protesters, all variously compelled to stillness and motion. Furthermore, increasingly, people are moving instead of the privileged. It is their fever of motion that is meeting the needs of our society and the desires of the privileged in our newfound immobility. Their mobility delivers essential services such as garbage pickup and much less essential services such as home delivery of trivial consumer goods. The general public is increasingly acknowledging professionals whose mobility is part of fighting the pandemic. People over the world applaud medical staff at shift change. A striking transnational example of this is indeed Cuba, whose Henry Reeve International Medical Brigades may soon be in the running for the Nobel Prize. Residents in over 22 countries cheer their arrival, recognizing these brigades' intrepid mobilization to international hotspots. Cuba's people over profit health system and its well-trained workers have made this economically impoverished country struggle against the virus one of the most successful, both internationally and also in the country itself. Themselves well paid and trained for free, Cuban professionals, the doctors and nurses, even give twice over. When their international assistance is not provided to the asker country for free, a sizable portion of their hard currency remuneration flows into public coffers to purchase imported necessities for Cuba's residents. Medical personnel are frontline workers. And more gradually, we recognize, so too are firefighters, police, repair persons. And then, even more gradually and perhaps uncomfortably, we recognize so too are the warehouse laborers, the slaughterhouse and field workers, the delivery drivers, the grocery store employees moving around us and in our stead. Once we acknowledge this latter group of laborers as frontline, our immobility becomes just that little bit less comfortable, as we see it as a little bit less noble. These workers are not mobile based on their expertise in their chosen profession. They are mobile because they need employment, whether or not they are simultaneously at high risk. The aim of our immobility is to flatten the curve by keeping ourselves safe. Yet, if the probability of contracting severe illness were the decisive factor in who is performing semi-skilled essential services that involve mobility, should others be doing this labor? Would hospital loads not decrease if young, healthy, white-collar workers took the place of young-at-heart grandmothers with underlying health conditions who are disinfecting our shopping carts? Or the undocumented delivery persons who cannot afford a trip to the emergency room for fear of deportation? It will be interesting to see if the vision of a Corona Corps of university-age students will gain traction, or if the financial exigencies of the corporate Northern University will force education to continue as usual, quality of remote education or perils of outbreak notwithstanding. In today's world, there are millions for whom both immobility and mobility present impossible choices and even deadly peril. Sweeping laws restricting mobility are often impossible for the underprivileged to obey. In Panama City, the two-hour limit on time outdoors makes it very difficult for poor people to shop, as lines are long and transit times even longer. Furthermore, men and women are allowed out on alternating days, which puts gender non-conforming people in a range of dangerous situations. In poor countries with authoritarian-style governments such as India, food vendors and delivery people encounter police violence, even as self-isolating customers need their services. Moreover, such violence is commonly unequally applied against visible minorities throughout the world. And there's been a lot of protest around that. Afghanistan and Nigeria are some of the many, many places in which people are having to choose between earning money for food and following stay-at-home orders. In parts of the global north, government mandates have been less strict, more differentiated, are arguably more attuned to consumer demand. However, it does not follow that semi-skilled workers of the front lines are freely choosing their mobility. Instead, they're weighing the risks and choosing a paycheck despite the dangers. Very few employers will pay them for not coming to work. And being a dual citizen, I respect that Canada is doing a much better job than the United States. So far, teenage spring breakers, you probably saw that on the news, who have come through this illness have only stepped up to the plate with mea culpas. However, this is not simply a mea culpa story, for although many of us practicing privileged immobility feel uncomfortable as we pay others to engage in high-risk mobility to service our needs, we also feel the discomforts of immobility itself. My field research plans are on hold. I cannot visit family. I cannot visit friends. I cannot attend events. I have no occasion to wear my high heels. Whether sacrifices or minor discontents, these are not fun facts. For all its privilege, this privileged immobility of ours is but the proverbial any port in a worldwide storm. And this reality that our current immobility is profoundly suboptimal, even for the most privileged among us, is driving us towards what needs to be done. For it turns out that our longtime privileged hypermobility is a significant contributing factor in this hypermobile pandemic. Carbon-fueled vehicle emissions are a primary cause of climate change, and climate change is a major cause of new disease spread. This pandemic is showing us in no uncertain terms that hypermobility is untenable. And Sunday drivers immobilized in their tiny metal boxes revving it down the road these days with nowhere to go suggest that it's simply no fun. The hollow immobility of the privileged in the time of COVID reveals that flattening the differentials among human mobilities are in the interest of all of us. That this truth is not new may have been somewhat forgotten in the recent thrill of cheap flights and overnight prime delivery. For instance, in the 1970s, that was primed for alternatives not only by pollution and hyper-consumerism, but also by the oil crisis and the economic recession. Expansive thinkers like Ivan Illich showed the direct relationship between the distribution of energy and the distribution of social equity in Energy and Equity, the book. Equivalent distribution furthered environmental and human health. And he quotes, "Calories are only biologically and socially healthy as long as they stay within the narrow range that separates enough from too much." Specifically of carbon-based transportation, Illich writes, "High-speed is the critical factor which makes transportation socially destructive. A true choice among political systems and of desirable social relations is possible only where speed is restrained. Participatory democracy demands low energy technology, and a free people must travel the road to productive social relations at the speed of a bicycle. Even today, jet travel remains largely the domain of the hypermobile 1%, while their movement directly impacts the mobility of others who walk barefoot. Unequal energy distribution is not only uncomfortably unfair, but it negatively impacts the life quality of even the hypermobile among us, as our current situation shows in spades. Much of our motorized lives are spent in non-places as we get from coveted point A to coveted point B, and while working to afford such journeys. Illich calculated that the average American male of his day spent 1,600 hours a year in the service of his privately owned vehicle. Inequitable mobility is both unfair and unfun. I guess some people like to polish their car, but this pandemic is laying bare the profound inequities of contemporary human society. It is showing us that we must fundamentally revamp societal structures. It is simultaneously showing us that inequitable mobility and its correlate, inequitable immobility, is unfair, unfun, and unsustainable. All of which points to its solution. Now is the time to work towards profound redistribution of our mobility assets. Working together, governments must deploy fiscal policies, such as debt buyback, qualitative easing, job guarantees, and large-scale labor-intensive projects, such as transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables, improving public transit, and repairing public infrastructure in order to resuscitate the economy while overcoming this disease and mitigating recurrences. They must work to flatten the mobility differential globally. The painful realities of the new mobile order in the time of COVID demonstrate that lives of more equitably distributed, moderate mobility are more sustainable and more worth sustaining. That's what I think. Thank you very much. And we'll just jump to the Q&A. It looks like we have a couple. Warren, you're taking this, right?
Yeah, so
fabulous.
That was great, Jen. And I think that if you've listened to both talks, what you really get is a sense of, there's some big opportunities that the pandemic has brought. And there's a lot of inequity that we can start to address in coming up with solutions. And, looking at mobility and how people move around and the impact of reducing emissions when we get people out of cars and get people doing different things. There's potentially some really good opportunities here now. So for those of you online, we have a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen if you're in a different operating system. If you move your mouse around, you'll see that come up. You can click there, you can post questions. We do have a couple of open questions right now, so we'll jump in. First one I think is really for me, but Jen, feel free to jump in. When will the oil and natural gas sectors peak globally as we go through these changes? It's a really good question, and a lot of people would like to know the answer to this. At the current rate, if we don't do anything, we just follow the business as usual, we go with kind of the increasing slice of renewables, which is big, but not as big as it needs to be to completely change the paradigm, we would probably start to see real reductions kicking in around 2040. So it's about 20 years out under the current regime, which sounds like a long time, but remember that 20 years ago, there was no peak in sight. The only peak that we were talking about was peak availability. We were worried about running out of oil. Right now, there's so much oil running around the world, we don't know where to put it all. We found new ways of getting oil out of the ground that likely come with other problems, but we've got a lot of oil. And that's why oil prices have remained relatively low since about 2008, 2010. We've seen relatively low prices. But we're not going to see real declines for about 20 years if we don't start to change policy. And that's where policy becomes very important, and managing this transition becomes really important. Jen, it's a little out of your wheelhouse, but do you want to say anything about that?
Well, just given the constraints of time, I'm going to jump to the second question, because I'm sure that you'll have something to say about the second question as well, because I think that you did a great job with that. It would be interesting to talk, if we had time, if it could be the case that there'll be a decrease in the use of oil because of the increased difficulty of getting it out of the ground and still making a kilojoule profit out of it. So if you would have time to address that afterward, then I would be grateful to that. And though this question is it's a very, very on target question. Do you think light duty fuel use will rebound post-pandemic due to fears of public transit, urban density driving people to live in the suburbs, and so forth? And I think that's what we're seeing already in parts of Asia, where cars are car purchasing is going through the roof, and that it's a big concern. Also because of a kind of equity as well, simply because not that driving in a car is safe. It's certainly not. Typically, driving in a bus would be even safer than driving in a car on average. But now with the COVID situation, it could be big, that could shift quite a bit. So I think it's an open question that I don't have a good answer for, and I would hope that there'll be policy put in place in order to encourage people not to go back to their cars once this ends.
Yeah, and I think that this is a big concern. Certainly, we've been hearing from the TTC and from the OC Transpo and the metro system in Montreal. They're all very worried about the loss of ridership. You know, TTC ridership had been going up year after year until the last couple of years. It had plateaued largely because capacity in the system was kind of maxed out. It was uncomfortable to add more. What we started to see just in March was a big decline in the number of people willing to take these subways or take the buses. And the people that are taking them, again, are the people that are in precarious positions, people without the income to be able to move to a personal vehicle or an Uber or whatever. We do have to do a lot of work to put people back into transit. It's also probably a really interesting time to question the modes of transport that we're investing in. I've worked for quite a few years looking at the sustainability of different mass transit systems. And mass transit is great when there is a mass to transit, when there's a lot of people who need to move. But there's an expectation among politicians that, you know, everybody should have access to a subway or everybody should have access to an LRT, when in many cases those solutions don't make sense for the density and for the ridership. And so, you know, better planning, better urban design, and better investment, I think, is what's really needed. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna move on. So there's a few other important questions. I'm gonna answer this quick one. Would I invest personally in green energy utilities? Yes, I would. I don't invest in energy companies as a rule because I study them. And so I invest in other things. I don't invest in energy companies because I don't want to be seen as in conflict when I say that something is good or something is bad. I hope that makes sense to whoever asked that question. Carolyn's asking, why is there so little emission reductions associated with the reduction in air travel? Well, there's so little reduction because air travel is only, at the best of time, 1 or 2% of our total emissions. We see it as a big problem. It's kind of that, you know, visible conspicuous consumption or conspicuous emissions. It has become more accessible over time, but it's still seen as something that, you know, the 1% really do. And I think that the reduction that we've seen, which is large, is 75% of emissions. You know, 3/4 of travel has stopped. And you're right, they've stopped a lot of service, but it's still a fairly massive drop. The more important question is, why do we spend so much time chasing aviation emissions? And I think, again, because it's very conspicuous, and there are other places where we could invest better.
I'd like to bring up the, thank you for that privilege point. That was very interesting, Warren. I think that it'll be interesting to see what happens with Europe in regards to trains and flights, because I think that the bucket flights, that might be ending in Europe because of fear of flying and because of the increasing push against those short flights, because it's recognized that it's so bad for the environment, and Europe frequently already has an existing train structure that would make it possible for people to take the train, but it's so much cheaper to fly that people fly. And so what would need to happen is that enough resources would need to be put into the train system to encourage better connections between the less well-endowed countries and the more well-endowed countries, as well as making changes to the structures within the trains in order to keep people safe should a pandemic, another pandemic come up, which undoubtedly I guess it will, but so that it won't be so disruptive, that you pretty much can still trust that you can take the train even in a pandemic. And perhaps that would be a solution actually to public transportation, which then would certainly require a lot of political will and planning and money.
Yeah. I think there's a really interesting question here about should we invest more in carbon capture technology and infrastructure? Certainly, I think carbon capture has a role to play. Probably not the kind of carbon capture and sequestration that has been promoted, where we capture flue gases and then pump them back into old oil wells. Where I do think that carbon capture and sequestration makes a lot of sense is in things like massive wooden structures. So you can sequester a lot of carbon, and you can sequester it for a long time doing useful things if you promote the right kind of building, the right kind of design, the right kind of products. But it does require a big social shift, and that goes back to Myron's comment. Can society change normally to adapt to the pandemic through social shifts and changes in the way we travel? Certainly we can. There's a question as to how much we want to and how much we're willing to change. I think that lots of people are very itchy for personal contact and to get out and see people again. And it's hard to just change society with rules. Society needs to want to change in order to make those changes. A couple last questions. I know we're pushing our time here. Do we have the idea that air travel is such a huge problem because it's one of the things that an individual might do that would constitute the biggest part of their carbon footprint? The absolute truth is that unless you're a student, and you might be, I'm not sure who is asking this, it's probably not the biggest part of your footprint. Unless you travel, you fly a lot. If you're the average person who travels by air once or maybe twice a year, those emissions are probably not as great as the emissions associated with heating your home, or driving a car, or taking cabs, or even taking transit, because air travel is a problem, but it is not as great of a problem as a lot of people perceive it as. It's a very visible problem, like I say, and I think that that's part of the reason we focus on it so much. Scott's asking about the changes we see in emissions are tied to restrictions. And, you know, we see, I'm going to try to summarize this, a lot of concern with advocates, and Greta Thunberg is one of the people that we talk about here, where advocates can move societal action much faster than scientists, and much faster than you know, maybe the way that scientists communicate. So basically the question here is, how does one communicate, and how do we get these messages across? And I think that the answer is really to communicate always. You know, it's not the old model of academia where we work for 3 years and then we publish something and get ideas out. There needs to be constant communication. We as academics need to be building lines out to various outlets. We need to be getting our ideas out there. And we need to recognize that different advocates and different users will use that information differently. You know, that's always been a concern. I know many academics don't like to talk to the media because they're concerned that they'll be misquoted. That's a danger, but you know, it's really getting the information out regularly and often. I don't know, Jen, if you have thoughts on that.
Well, and I'd like to add, I agree with that, and then I think that this series is trying to do precisely that by, for example, this opening talk speaking about the connection between COVID and climate, and pandemics are being facilitated or engendered by climate change and global warming. So when we as people who to some extent can influence the public sphere, and other people that can influence the public sphere continuously make those connections, then there'll, I believe, be more willingness for people to care about things like climate change, because they won't see COVID as just sort of a random occurrence, but actually very much connected to lots and lots of things that we're doing very unsustainably. One major one being heating up or changes like intensifying the climate through our activities.
He was asking how long capital markets will support fossil investment. I would actually argue that a lot of big investment firms and trusts are pulling out. We've seen that even the Norwegian Sovereign Trust, which is essentially their offshore investment fund set up to invest oil revenues from Norway, is pulling back on a lot of investments, including oil sands investments. There's been a change, and there continues to be a change, although I say that on the same day that Warren Buffett's made a $10 billion investment in the energy sector. So what do I know, Hugh? I don't know if I'd take investment advice from me, but I think that there is a shift that's happening right now. And then the last comment, and this is a great one for us to wrap up on. What's the biggest change that we as individuals can make within our communities? Jen, do you want to start on this one?
My answer would be look to your skill set and your interests and your knowledge base, and go from there and do something. Maybe you want to be a little more precise, Warren?
Well, I would say you're right. Do what you can and identify the things that you can do. But, you know, the other big thing that we can do is we can vote. And I would say that paying attention to the platforms of the parties and voting is an important way to make changes. And this applies right across the board, all different stripes. You know, I think that some of our political parties have been slow to pick up energy or climate related policies simply because they see it as outside of their purview or something that would not please their base. But you know, things are changing. We have a very active young population that wants to be involved. Vote, and you will start to see some of the changes come in.
Fabulous. Thank you all for coming. Very interesting questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we do come back next week, Tuesday at 4 p.m. So do
With
tune in
Samantha King.
with Samantha
Sorry.
King. That's right. And I hope all of you will come back. Thank you so much for participating. Have a great evening.